Welcome again to A Cup of Coffee with Colliers Louisiana, our web series where we have conversations with business and industry leaders who somehow influence commercial real estate in the Gulf South. Today with us is Bret Swango, and Bret is the Senior Vice President of Workforce Analytics and Location Strategy with Colliers. So I guess my first introduction to you, Bret, here to our recipients, what exactly is Workforce Analytics and Location Strategies Vice President? And how did you get there?
We really think of it as basically using data to help companies decide one, where to locate, and then two, how to most efficiently finance their occupancy once they've selected a location. I've been at Colliers about 10 years now, leading this group for almost 5. And I came from the insurance arena, so spent the first 3-4 years of my career at Allstate in corporate finance and then operational analytics. So really it was like first half of that time in corporate finance is, what are the key assumptions behind the capital that the various business units are requesting from the business to make said investments. And that really comes down to how good are the assumptions in those models, right? So what are the things that really matter and how do you get really good information to enable what we call quantitatively defensible recommendations? And then the other piece of that was what we call operational analytics, which is effectively using the data scientists and the actuaries, or what I call the analytical horsepower of the insurance organization, to solve other non-pricing related business problems. So how we staff our call centers, how we comp our agents, or most similar to what I do today was agency deployment, right? You got 10,000 agents around the country. If you're going to put one more anywhere to maximize their odds of being successful, where would you put them? What are the supply side and demand side variables that you'd want to analyze? And that obviously translates pretty directly to the stuff I'm doing today. Hey, you're trying to open a new X facility. Well, what are the key considerations in terms of your consumer demand as well as competition? And then obviously understanding the supply side of the story of where can you actually find the adequate resources to make that business successful. So that's really what we do within this particular business group, with obviously a big focus on labor.
So when we're talking about attracting new business to a specific jurisdiction or to an area, what are the most important things that those businesses look for? And what are the exact analytics that you would use to help those businesses make the decision?
Well, the answer to that depends on what type of business it is, of course. It's a different question whether it's distribution versus manufacturing versus life science versus traditional back office, right? But like a few of the commonalities they have is infrastructure, right? So that could be, labor availability. Obviously, everybody cares about cost. And then the other piece is risk, right? And how you define risk in each of those elements is different, but one commonality across most of them anyway, which is where I got into this space originally, was on the labor side. Typically a company, whether it's in distribution, manufacturing, or even office, they're spending anywhere from 5, 6, 7 to maybe even 15x on labor that they are real estate. So you can get as good a real estate or as cheap of a real estate option as you want, but if it's not in the right geography to get access to said labor to staff that facility, you're answering what we would always say is that you found the right answer to the wrong question, which is how do I get the cheapest real estate option versus how do you minimize your total operating costs while also minimizing risk, right? Because every executive, their goal is to maximize shareholders' risk-adjusted returns. So the return piece of that is how do you push down cost? The risk piece of that is how do you minimize risk? And what is risk? Risk is one of the variables that really matter that you don't have good information on. And then how do you pair those with the right expertise? Because some of the stuff is not entirely quantitative. So putting together that quantitative, that qualitative, understanding what you know and what you don't know, and then how do you get best-in-class information and expertise to guide those decisions. That's really our role.
Well, and we hear one thing you didn't mention there are incentives. And we hear a lot when we're talking to jurisdictions about incentives. It seems like whether it's at a state level, a county level, a local level, everybody wants to offer these, again, to incentivize business to move there. But how important are incentives, and what kind of incentives are winning business these days?
Yeah, so I'm a member of Colliers Economic Incentives Practice. Our job there is to basically say, you found the right operating location. Now, how do we help you most efficiently finance your operations there? Part of that is the real estate side. The other piece of that is how do we help maximize the incentives that we're able to procure on your behalf? The age-old analogy is that incentives are the tail. Don't let them wag the dog. I mean, I got an email earlier today from a group who's like, hey, we got a call from a VC. It's in the life science arena. And they're like, hey, we want to understand where the incentives are best for this company to go locate. And again, depending on what stage your company is in from a life cycle perspective, you see startups are hyper-focused on incentives because I think they see incentives. They think of it like, hey, I'm going to get this big check. So they almost see it as another form of capital raising, right? Which
Right.
any good founder in a startup, like almost half of his core job or a third of his core job is actually raising capital, right? So you find them really focused on it versus your more mature, sophisticated industries. They obviously are going to emphasize it because, it's a point of negotiation, right? So they're going to emphasize it, but at the end of the day, it's going to play a very small role. Because, on a typical project, which again this is all over the board, but you'd expect maybe 15 to 30% of the CapEx. And again, that varies based on the wage. Really, incentives come down to three things. This should also be known by your audience. It's really about number of jobs, the wage level per job, and then the CapEx.
Right.
Right. So you got office projects where there's less CapEx, maybe more jobs and higher paying jobs. You got distribution where maybe there's quite a bit of CapEx in the building or the automation equipment, but fewer jobs and lower paying jobs. So anywhere on that spectrum. And again, you could see anywhere from 80% to 0% of the CapEx associated with a project might be covered by incentives. But let's just say it's, 15 to 25, 15 to 30 is not a bad number for, several hundred jobs, $100 million project paying, 50 to 70 grand a year per job. That'd be kind of a typical range that I would expect. But if you look at what percent, okay, you're talking 15 to 25% of the overall CapEx. But then when you look at the OpEx associated with operating that facility and you run that out 10 or 15 years, it's rare that you see incentives account for more than like 1 to 3%, maybe 1 to 4% of the 15-year NPV of that operation, right? So making your entire decision around a 1 to 4% delta, we typically see, if we're looking across a 4 or 5 state region, even in like kind of like a typical manufacturing, even distribution, like you'll see a wage spread anywhere from, 12 to 25%. If you're looking across, again, depending on what the parameters are and geographically how wide, but I just did one of these where it's 5 states across the Southeast. And there was like a 27% differential in our call it long list, I call it preliminary short list. So our final like 8 locations. Yeah, there's about a 20+% differential in wages. That's going to be much more impactful than the incentives, almost no matter what the incentive package looks at, regardless of location. So again, part of our job as your advisor is helping you identify and prioritize what are the things that really matter. Because one thing we know for sure is no location has everything that you're looking for. But our job is to help you balance between your business needs and our expertise. What are the things that matter most? And then how do we most efficiently go about identifying the sites that are going to best meet your needs? Again, in terms of balancing that risk versus cost equation.
No, it makes total sense. Specifically, we're in this geography here in the Gulf South where we cover kind of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and we think of them together as that Gulf South region. There are obviously differences between each state and differences between nuances between, say the I-10 corridor, the I-20 corridor, which runs the I-20 corridor running across the north side of each of those states, the I-10 corridor running across the south. But as it relates to the Gulf South together, how do we stack up against other regions of the country, like especially the coastal regions, like the mid-Atlantic states or the Northeast or the West Coast?
Yeah, obviously, like it's industry specific, it's skill set specific, it's call it operating cost profile specific, right? Because there's some oil and gas resources there, both in terms of relative affordability as well as the core skill sets themselves, where I think you guys are definitely at an advantage. The labor affordability overall is quite compelling in that specific region. But again, the drawback, and this is something we talked about when I was there with you guys in person, or the piece that I think that the area needs to do the best job of, marketing and or quantifying is all the investment that's been done from an infrastructure perspective post Katrina to help build up that resiliency and minimize the ultimate risk associated with natural disasters. Because I think if I were forecasting out 5 or 10 years, that's only going to become a bigger piece of that weighted scorecard. So making sure that you understand who are the types of companies where maybe there's less of a mission critical element to it, and or that specific site itself, you really understand the core story associated with what its risk level is from that 100-year floodplain, that 100-year storm, et cetera. That's, I think, the big piece to make sure that, just like when I was in Phoenix, their big question is, hey, what the water story? It's like, okay, that's going to be the question everybody has. So making sure that you have best-in-class data when somebody's walking in, so that you can't just talk about all the things that you're doing, but you can get that as quantitative as possible for that audience. Because, business executives, their core language is numbers. So the better that you can present your story from a quantitative perspective, the higher the probability that you're going to be on more of those short lists in terms of from a site selection perspective.
Yeah, you mentioned that you got the chance to come down here a few weeks ago, and we'll get back to that. But before we do, what do you think our biggest challenge is here in both in South Louisiana and then as a little broader region too in South Mississippi and South Alabama? I mean, how do we get our story out there? What's the biggest challenge that we see?
Yeah, I would just echo my prior comment regarding like the natural disaster risk. That's going to be that's going to be the biggest concern. Because I mean, you got the affordability narrative. And again, with interest rates where they are currently and from a longer term perspective where I think they're going to be, especially with the new administration, affordability is going to become, we already saw that it was definitely one of the two most important issues, if not the most important issue in this last election cycle. So that's going to continue to be a big piece of the story. The big concern is going to be from a risk perspective and how effectively your team is able to quantify and then communicate that both in terms of Colliers locally as well as more nationally.
So again, getting back to the part of the conversation where you came down here for a visit a couple of weeks ago, I'm very interested to find out what you thought about our geography, because when you came in, it was at the behest of GNO Inc., who invited you down here to come and take a look basically at the New Orleans area and the New Orleans market. What were your perceptions before you got here? What did you learn when you got here? And then did your perception change when you left, or how did your perception change by the time you left?
I think key takeaways were the quality of life and the value proposition. I'd been there once on the tail end of an LSU football trip for lunch briefly, but getting to spend some time in the city, just the relative affordability and the quality of life balance. Obviously, your summers are pretty warm, but unless you're in California, pretty much everywhere across the country, right, has some balance of you either get cold winters or you get hot summers. I think the value in terms of the quality of life and the cost of living was quite compelling to me. And that's where my first question went to. Okay, I want to understand this risk factor more because I know cost is going to become more important, and you guys can offer an urban lifestyle at a really affordable price point in a way that much of the Southeast no longer can. I mean, if you look at like Zillow's top markets for home appreciation, right? 2 years ago, it was Tampa, Jacksonville, Raleigh were like three of the top four. This year, top four, we're talking Buffalo, Cincinnati, Columbus, Indianapolis, right? That's because the Midwest is like that last affordable kind of pocket of the country. And so I look at you guys and you're the last affordable pocket in many ways of the Southeast. So just being able to make sure that you can communicate that risk story or all the things that have been done to mitigate that risk. I'd love to see you market yourself as, hey, we're just a bigger Charleston, right? Like what does Charleston have? It has the history. It's got a little bit of the urban environment, but it's, got that local kind of like Southeastern, the quality of the food, the hospitality of the people. You guys have that with a little bit more of maybe even a party vibe. I was really, really impressed with the area. And then also just the GNO folks and the understanding of your value proposition and the way that they're trying to get that message into the market.
Thank you for coming down. It's a really big thing for us to be able to figure out a way to get the story out about South Louisiana specifically, but also about the region, about the connectivity between the ports from Mobile all the way to New Orleans, or actually all the way to Lake Charles. I mean, those are stories that need to be told, and any way that we can get them out there, I think is helpful. So thank you for coming in. So let's look into your crystal ball. I always like to ask this question to people and kind of put them on the spot and say 10 years from now, if you're looking back at the Gulf South, what role do you think we're going to be playing at that point in the national economy?
I guess if you just look at the way with more of the deglobalization narrative and more of from a port level perspective, I think the opportunity for you guys to play a much bigger role in that integration of the Americas. A lot of the narratives that we're going to be less reliant on Asian countries from a trade perspective, and that's going to become much more regionalized. I think there's potentially a big opportunity there. The role that you can play in as far as getting your name in the mix is another one of the quote unquote core port markets in much the same way that Houston, I think, has the last 10-ish years. I think that's a big opportunity area. And then again, I think the culture and the marketing of the relative affordability of the area, this affordability crisis, in my opinion, is not going anywhere anytime soon. So just making sure that you've got your ducks in a row there. Again, I'm numbers guy, so I always come back to this, but a very quantitative narrative around, hey, we know that we're not perfect from a risk perspective, but here's why we think we're a heck of a value. Because when you look at our cost relative to our risk, it's really unparalleled value across the country.
Well, great. Anything else that you you'd like to touch on before we go?
I think the affordability perspective is not maybe appreciated as much from a typical industrial broker, the way it is, like, if you're talking to multifamily folks, like where they're seeing that shift. Our multifamily group, I was just on with our guys that run the Midwest and Southeast, and we were having this same discussion about pockets of the Midwest and how much activity they're seeing. So I think the affordability piece is maybe not appreciated as much from industrial brokers on how important that is. I remember I asked Stephanie Rodriguez, our head of industrial, I was like, hey, Stephanie, just, what's one blip? Like, this is probably 12 months ago or something. How do you think about where folks should be investing right now? She goes, ports, right? So I think a combination of those two themes are a real opportunity for the area.
Well, great. Well, Bret, thank you. Listen, it's great to know that, we have this resource that we can tap at Colliers of you and your group, but also just to be able to bring that kind of resource to the Gulf South market. We haven't had a lot of institutional players here in the last several years. We haven't had a lot of attention in several years, and we're starting to get it again. And having the expertise of people like you is going to be paramount to our success. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for having a cup of coffee with Colliers.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me, Chris.